the mood still growing among your members, because we've discussed this before, to be able to protect themselves better?
That's correct. At the end of the day, what the shop owners saying, if they do not protect themselves, they get stabbed. And if they try to protect themselves, they get charged. So here what we are saying is that the shop owners or any dairy owners or any person should have the right to self-defense. And that modus and operandi, the mode it need to be redefined. It need to be defined from the lawmakers what the self-defense is. And yes, every person, there's a natural system that one has to protect themselves.
All right. Sorry, you go, Bernard. Yes.
Yeah. Are you seriously saying that people who are committing aggravated assault believe they won't have to go to prison?
That's what my understanding is. Because
I would have thought the sentencing for that is more than 2 years.
If the person has been, sentenced to 2 years, so that means that offense is not so low, right? 2 years is quite a serious one. But if our judicial system is letting them go or would let them go, so
not for an aggravated assault.
Fear of the law.
There have been some quite serious cases though, Bernard, and I'd be interested to dig them out, but I was reading something about this a couple of weeks ago when we discussed the General Territory, of people doing something violent that actually ended up with them being in jail less than 2 years. But I'm not saying it's common, but it can happen. Sonny, I've got to leave it there today, but all the best for the family, the mother and the son, in their recovery today, and thank you for joining us again, Sonny Carson.
Certainly, I will convey them, and I'm meeting them tomorrow, the victims, so we will convey your regards.
All right, thank you. Meanwhile, since Christie's law was implemented, just staying on the topic for a sec, tightening up the bail laws, more than 1,000 extra people are being held in jail rather than being granted bail. And not all those people are going to commit mayhem on bail, but some of them do. So deep down, would you sooner see them kept inside or not? I mean, if somebody, for example, involved in robbing a dairy, would you be happier knowing he or she's inside or outside?
If what they did is a violent act, I would like them to be held. And that would make me feel safer and more secure.
The trouble is, though, that many of those people who are on remand are not necessarily there for violent offences or have a history of violent offences. My understanding is that a lot of the people are there because of blockages in the justice system, which mean that there are extremely long periods between people being accused and going to trial or even not going to trial. And there's a systemic problem across the corrections, justice and police systems, not to mention our society, where over generations you've got failures right from the beginning, where kids are growing up in cold, mouldy homes with stressed parents and poor education and poor connections to their communities, and then lo and behold they find community and connections with people in the gangs or wherever who can give it to them. That's the wider problem.
Yeah, but if 10 in that 1,000 don't come to your house and murder you like they would have if you hadn't been on bail, then I'm happy.
And that's the specific problem. All right, thank you. Lisa Scott, congratulations on the licence.
I know.
Live long and prosper on the roads. Bernard Hickey, thank you for your company today. And we're back. Thanks for your company, everybody. We're back tomorrow and Checkpoint's on the way.
Tō te mairai, hoa mai, hei kōrero, kei te haere, hei kaupapa, kei te karawhiua. Tonight on Checkpoint, the government refuses to release evidence of serious misconduct in the Ministry of Primary Industries, and the SIS, who have so much power to scrutinise, refused to give us an interview. Nurses across the country confirm they will walk off the job for 24 hours. On July 5th, Auckland police call for witnesses after a violent dairy attack leaves a woman in her 60s and her adult son with serious stab wounds. US President Donald Trump is heckled on Capitol Hill as momentum grows in Congress to end his policy of separating migrant children from their parents at the Mexican border. And we speak to a man who works in a detention centre for children.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batanaho. The US President has been on Capitol Hill holding talks with Republican leaders as momentum grows in Congress to end his policy of separating migrant children with their parents at the Mexican border. As images of children behind wire fences spark criticism both at home and abroad, Donald Trump is facing pushback from top Republicans who want an end to the policy. The Democratic House leader Chuck Schumer says the president could end the current situation with a phone call.
President Trump, if you're truly ashamed of what's happening at the border, get your team together and undo this shameful policy immediately, which you can do with a flick of the pen. There's no need for legislation. There's no need for anything else. You can do it. Mr. President, you started it. You can stop it.
Donald Trump has been insisting the policy can only end if Democratic Party politicians agree to a law change. The Deputy Prime Minister says New Zealand has not officially expressed its concern to the United States over the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy on immigration. Winston Peters says the government is watching the situation carefully, but no official protest has been lodged.
Look, we're not going to have a contest to see who's most outraged. Every cabinet minister and member of parliament in this country and most leading citizens are concerned with what's developing there. But as I say, it's an internal debate at the moment which is possibly going to go either way, and we're watching that with great interest.
Winston Peters says New Zealand will raise its concerns at the appropriate time when it meets with US representatives. And the UN Human Rights Chief has described the American withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council as disappointing. The United States pulled out of the council, citing concerns about the human rights record of some other members and what it says is bias against Israel. The BBC's Nick Bryant reports.
This decision makes the United States the first country to leave the 47-member body voluntarily. America's UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, described it as a cesspool of political bias that was hypocritical and self-serving, and in particular slammed its chronic bias against Israel. This America First administration had sought to reform the body, but ultimately decided to unilaterally withdraw, as was the case with the UN-backed Paris Climate Accord and the Iranian nuclear deal.
Nick Bryant in New York. Nurses around the country have confirmed they'll strike next month. Those covered by the Nurses Union collective agreement will stop work for 24 hours from 7 a.m. on July the 5th. Laura Dooney has the details.
District health boards have started putting contingency plans in place after receiving the strike notice. A second notice for another strike in July is expected next week. A DHB spokesperson, Helen Mason, says they will do everything they can to avoid the strikes and will go into mediation with the nurses on Friday. The Nurses Union this week rejected an offer from district health boards worth more than $500 million. It included pay rises of 9% over the next 15 months and an increase in staffing. Ko Laura Dooney aho.
Tolaga Bay landowners are about to meet with forestry companies and the Gisborne District Council to discuss recent flooding. Heavy rain on June the 4th and 12th washed away thousands of tonnes of forestry debris known as slash, which blocked rivers and wrecked farmland. Emma Hatton reports.
36 properties were damaged and farmers are calling for forestry companies to take responsibility. They want $100 million of compensation and all forestry operations in the area to halt until a government inquiry takes place. The three main forestry companies, Earnslaw One, PF Olsen and Hikurangi Forest Farms, says they will help with the clean-up but haven't addressed whether they will pay out or stop harvesting. A meeting last week with the forestry companies was described by one farmer as a circus, with discussions going round in circles. This is Emma Hatton.
Auckland Transport has signed off on its 10-year budget. The $16.5 billion plan includes funding for roading upgrades, public transport projects and safety improvements. One of the big priorities is improving safety for all road users, but especially pedestrians, cyclists and motorcyclists. Auckland Transport's chair, Lester Levy, says a priority is reducing speeds, which could include lowering limits through busy town centres. Other initiatives include funding for new red light cameras at high-risk intersections. It's 5:05. Sport. New Zealand football denies it was aware of the extent of the problems within the football Ferns before receiving a letter of complaint from players. The coach of the New Zealand women's team, Andreas Heref, has been placed on leave while an independent investigation is carried out into the breakdown of the relationship between him and the players. On Monday, New Zealand Football received a letter from the Professional Football's Association outlining several complaints from players about Heref, but Chief Executive Andy Martin says until that point he was unaware of the problems.
We knew there was change in management going on, and there were some people on board and some people not. But the extent of what's come through from the letters, there was no indication of that at all. And look, the process has worked. The reason why the union is there is for our employees to be able to have a say. And that's worked and it's come through and we've responded quickly.
Andy Martin. The French rugby side are still smarting from the red card their fullback Benjamin Fall was issued in the series-defining second test loss to the All Blacks in Wellington. France was reduced to 14 players early on when Fall was sent off after taking Beauden Barrett out in mid-air. The red card was later rescinded, but it was too late as the French now trail 2-0 in the three-test series. The Timaru-born French prop Eugenie Antonio says the sending off ruined the chance of a series decider in Dunedin on Saturday.
Even some people on the road, we just go walk past them and they're just telling us that there wasn't a red card. And to pull out a red card in a game which could have been a good game kind of ruins it, because if we had won that one, it would have been a good third test. Now we're playing for nothing.
Eugenie Antonio. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, the rebirth of futurism with the Italian composer Luciano Chiesa. This week's episode of Bang sees Melody Thomas exploring the topic of masculinity. We'll be taking your questions and comments afterwards. And our window on the world asks, who shot JFK? You'd think they'd have worked that one out by now.
And between 10 and 11 p.m, join me, Karen Hay, for Lately. We'll be focusing on the events of the day, both nationally and internationally, and talking to the newsmakers in an eclectic mix that covers everything from the arts to politics to live events. That's Lately with Karen Hay in the 10 p.m. hour, weeknights on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland and Auckland, north of Orewa. Rain with heavy falls and localised downpours and possible thunderstorms gradually clearing tomorrow afternoon and evening. Strong southeasterlies in exposed places. For the remainder of Auckland, Waikato and Coromandel Peninsula, cloudy with scattered rain north of Cambridge, clearing tomorrow and becoming mainly fine. Waitomo to the Kapiti coast, including Bay of Plenty in the central high country, mainly fine but cloudy skies today from Taupo northwards. Gisborne to Wairarapa, often cloudy with a few showers, clearing inland Wairarapa later tomorrow. Wellington and Marlborough, fine apart from cloud and a few showers about the eastern coasts and ranges. Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland, fine. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, cloudy periods today, becoming mostly fine tomorrow. However, low cloud and fog persisting in some valleys, frosts morning and night. And the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods, a few showers clearing tomorrow. It's just gone 5:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten, and thank you everyone for being with us. Tonight we begin with what appears to be a fairly striking contradiction. Thompson and Clark scrutinise people, to put it, well, euphemistically, usually without their knowledge. But the government agencies who've used them would not subject themselves to the same scrutiny in public by appearing on Checkpoint. We've had a day of no's, emphatic no's, despite the power imbalance here and despite compelling public interest. First, the Ministry for Primary Industries, which is refusing to release the evidence they have of serious staff misconduct in their relationship with Thompson and Clark. The alleged misconduct relates to several former staffers' dealings with the controversial security firm and was found after an Official Information Act request from RNZ. MPI has forwarded that evidence to the State Services Commission, saying it's serious, but it's currently refusing to release it to the public and is refusing to explain why not or what it all means. Now, the Security Intelligence Service, or SIS, has released evidence of its staff acting unprofessionally in their relationship with Thompson and Clark, but is refusing to talk to us about what that means and the implications of a spy agency with enormous power behaving in such a fashion. The evidence so far shows staff at the SIS appear to have helped Thompson and Clark book contracts with various government agencies. Here's Zach Fleming looking at the SIS and MPI.
The Ministry for Primary Industries says it has evidence of serious staff misconduct in dealing with Thompson and Clark, but it's refusing to release that evidence. The State Services Minister, Chris Hipkins, won't talk about it.
I have some insight into that, but that's a matter for MPI to comment on. I'm not commenting on the specifics of any of those investigations.
So, as advised, we went to MPI, but MPI won't comment. It's not only refusing to release the evidence, it's refusing to explain why it's keeping that evidence secret. The excuse given is that there's an investigation, but that's just that, an excuse. SIS released evidence of its staff being unprofessional and biased toward Thompson and Clark, and it's also investigating. So today we went to anyone we could to find out more. We found lots of concerned ministers.
I've made it clear to the State Services Commissioner that I've got concern.
Look, I don't agree with it at all. Thompson and Clark seem to have used their contacts within state departments to take advantage.
A serious concern that you've got state agencies that would be dealing with private contractors in that way.
But no ministers that would actually say anything new. Director General of the SIS, Rebecca Kitteridge, won't talk. Damien O'Connor, one of the ministers in charge of MPI, says he doesn't know much.
I don't know too many of the details other than I welcome an investigation.
And like everyone else, Winston Peters is concerned, but won't say anything either.
I have to wait the outcome of the Commissioner's inquiry and see, and he's got a very good team's been laid out there, or a couple of investigators, so let's see what happens.
But ministers seem to be either unwilling or unable to ask the right questions.
Does it bother you that this stuff is only coming to light as a result of journalists' questions and not through any kind of self-regulation by government agencies?
Well, the Prime Minister made it very clear earlier in the year that she doesn't want to see this continue. So our government has made that very clear. It's clear.
News Hub broke the story of Southern Response earthquake claimants being spied on by Thompson and Clark, which is what started this inquiry. Then the inquiry expanded to include MB after TVNZ reported Thompson and Clark spied on Greenpeace. Now it's expanded to all government agencies after RNZ uncovered evidence of unprofessional conduct at MPI and the SIS.
I'm not aware of any other departments under my responsibility. I have to say I haven't actively inquired.
Andrew Little, the minister responsible for the GCSB and SIS, didn't check if his ministries were acting above board. The government's failure to self-investigate its use of Thompson and Clark is now prompting private companies to demand reassurances. Deborah Ashton, the chief executive of animal welfare charity SAFE, wrote a letter asking
whether any information about Farm Watch or SAFE for that matter has been provided to Thompson and Clark either directly or indirectly by anyone at MPI.
Confidence in the government clearly being eroded for some people by this Thompson and Clark scandal. John Darroch from Farm Watch wants reassurances too.
About how information which we provide to MPI will be protected in the future, so it can't be given to people who shouldn't have access to it.
So why not just ban the use of Thompson and Clark, given so many ministers are concerned with the way it conducts its business? Because it might be in the too hard basket.
In order to prevent government agencies using a particular supplier of any sort, that would require a law change.
So until the State Services Commission is finished with its investigation, government agencies are still free to use Thompson and Clark as they please. For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
And our request to MPI and the SIS to appear on Checkpoint, we really do think they should front on this, remain open for the duration of the program. It finishes at 6:30. If you're from either of those agencies and mandated to talk, we would love to hear from you. Let's move on. The football Ferns coach Andreas Heraf is on special leave whilst an independent investigation is carried out into the relationship breakdown between him and some of the players. On Monday, New Zealand Football received a letter from the Professional Footballers Association outlining several complaints from players in the national women's team. At a media conference late this afternoon, the New Zealand Football President, Derek Shaw, said he was disappointed 13 players, remember there's only 11 in a team, felt the need to lodge a formal complaint. CEO Andy Martin, who last week said he wasn't aware of any issues between the players and Heraf, has today changed his tune.
Right up until probably the week or 2 weeks before the last activity, the Japan game, we were getting endorsements about the change programme, what was going on from players, from a whole range of people, some in the public domain that you'll have seen. So going into that camp, we knew we were making changes. We knew Andreas was making changes that we'd asked him to make. And this was very much about performance and making sure we drive our performance up. Because let's be clear, you know, the last two Pinnacle events, as I said last week, we did not perform. So changes were needed. So we knew there was change management going on, and there were some people on board and some people not. But the extent of what's come through from the letters, there was no indication of that at all. And as I said last week, as soon as we get facts, and look, the process has worked. The reason why the union is there is for our employees to be able to have a say, and that's worked and it's come through and we've responded quickly.
That's CEO Andy Martin calling a spade an inverted digging implement by the sound of things. Clay Wilson, you were at the media conference. Tell us about it. A lot of people are very eager to hear from Andy Martin since all of this has gone public. What was his response to them? People were pretty angry about this.
Yeah, despite a lot of reports of people will have read to the contrary, Martin claimed that it was a shock when these complaints came on Monday night from the players via the players' union. He claims that there were isolated incidents previously, but nothing that was hard evidence around something to investigate. He said they looked into a few things and didn't see anything really untoward. So they basically viewed it as a few teething problems around some of the changes Haraf was making around trying to get the team to perform better, and they didn't really see anything really worth digging into.
13 players felt the need to lodge a formal complaint.
Yeah.
Right.
As I said, despite reports and evidence to the contrary.
Okay. Martin has said there's some support for this Beliga coach, even from players. He maintains that stance.
Yeah, he was directly asked actually how many players are supporting. He stuttered for a while before answering 5 or 6. He seemed rather unsure. He did claim last week that Captain Ellie Riley supports that. He said he hadn't spoken to her since these complaints had come out, but he certainly still maintains, without being able to name names pointedly, that there are people out there that supported Haraf and what he was doing and saw logic in the way he was going about things.
Okay. Many people are also calling for Andy Martin to step down as a result of the saga, and there does seem to have been a profound variation as his story over a period of days. Any chance that will happen? Yeah,
football people will very well remember the eligibility saga of 2015 when the All Whites weren't able to go to the Olympics as a result. So this isn't the first thing under Andy Martin's watch that's perhaps gone awry. But Andy Martin certainly seems comfortable in his position. Obviously, this review is going to go deep. We're going to find out if anything that he did or actions he did or didn't take are going to have a result. President Derek Shaw said that, but I asked Andy Martin directly if he felt comfortable. He said he did, and Derek Shaw said the board still backed Andy Martin. So it doesn't look like he's going anywhere in the immediate interim.
News broke today about football Ferns players being contacted by New Zealand Football about potential complaints. What did Andy Martin have to say about that? What was going on here, Clay?
Yeah, interesting, because he didn't know today who had done that, if they had done that, if that was true. Obviously, there's certain things that have to be protected once these complaints come in an employer-business relationship. Once complaints are made, people in the business can't be contacting players or people that have made the complaints. So he wasn't really sure about that. He said he hoped not, but the reports are certainly that the likes of Haraf and some other business members perhaps have been contacting them, and he said maybe that was because there was close relationships within the Ferns and staff felt like they needed to reach out to some of the players, but it doesn't seem entirely appropriate to a lot of people, I guess.
No, potentially. This is a sort of sports variation of an employment dispute, isn't it?
Exactly,
so,
yeah.
Okay. What's next and how long will we have to wait before we know more, Clay?
Yeah, well, the next thing we're going to know is who is going to carry out this independent investigation. We're not sure who that's going to be there yet, neither in New Zealand Football. So I would say hopefully next week we will have an idea about that. And then I guess it's how long is a piece of string in terms of how long does this take. There's obviously a lot to cover. These are serious allegations. So how long exactly it will take, I'm not sure. But certainly the likes of Haraf and potentially Andy Martin, their roles are on the line at the end of this investigation.
Yeah, hell yeah. Clay Wilson, a sports reporter who was at that media conference. Quite an extraordinary state of affairs. Thank you so much, Clay. It's coming up to 90 minutes past 5. Thanks for being with us, everyone. Nurses across the country have this afternoon confirmed they will walk off the job for 24 hours on July 5th. The strike follows the rejection of a deal from the DHBs, which included pay rises of 9% over the next 15 months for some nurses, some eligible for a 15% pay increase. That's at the upper end of the pay scale. DHB spokesperson Helen Mason joins us now live. Helen, are you there?
I am. Hello, John.
Hi, lovely to have you with us on Checkpoint. Thank you for joining us. What's your take on this news?
that we absolutely, nurses, midwives and healthcare assistants, John, are really highly valued members of DHB teams. We completely respect their right to industrial action. At the same time, our priority is keeping patients safe. And so DHBs are working very, very hard to ensure that we've got really robust contingency plans in place should the strike go ahead. Having said that, John, I remain optimistic that we're going to find a settlement before there is strike action. We're working very closely with NZNO. DHBs are really committed to doing everything that we possibly can to reach settlement on this agreement to avoid disruption to health services.
Right, how can you do that, given the government has said there is not a dollar more in the kitty? What is it that you believe, in good faith, you can offer that will make a difference?
But, John, I think that in terms of what this means for nurses, midwives and healthcare assistants pay packages, I think it's an excellent offer. And I think that that's part of the equation. I think that there are many things actually outside of what people take home in their pay that are of concern to our nurses. And that's about working conditions. And we've heard nurses' frustrations and their concerns around this, and DHBs have responded to it. So the reason that I'm optimistic is I think that there are things outside of pay and outside of the dollars that are on the table at the moment, which is $500 million, and that we can work on. I think that what we need to do is that we need to give nurses trust and confidence that DHBs have heard them and that DHBs are going to be taking action to improve working conditions for nurses. So
okay, let's talk about how you can do that. How can you meaningfully and materially improve working conditions to such an extent that the nurses call the strike off?
So I think that what nurses need is confidence that DHB is going to be taking action over the short term. Part of the offer, John, is the additional $48 million, which is for an additional 500 nurses. So what I'm hearing nurses talking about is their concerns about, when things get busy, is there a colleague to call in? Is there an additional nurse to bring in when things are really busy? So that $48 million is about bringing in an additional 500 nurses, and I think that will be a substantial help. I think it's also about DHB's commitment to the full implementation of the Safe Staffing Program and care capacity demand management. There's another $10 million to make sure that all DHBs have got resource to get to full implementation. And the other thing as well, John, that's kind of outside of the pay package is DHB's commitment to work with nurses on pay equity.
Okay,
I think there are a lot of things that we can work on that are outside the dollar value, and really I want nurses to know that we have heard their concerns and their frustrations, and we're deeply committed to improving their work conditions.
Absolutely, and that's a point you've repeated a couple of times, and I'm sure any nurses listening will have heard that. But if you can't persuade them that that is meaningful and material, if you can't make that flesh and concrete, if you like, what are you going to do to cover for potentially 27,000 striking nurses?
DHBs are working really hard on contingency plans. And, John, we're actually working very closely with NZNO and together on the contingency plans. I'd like to reassure our communities that DHBs have been, and, we always hope for the best, but we have to plan for the worst. So we've been working on contingency plans for months now. And now that we have strike notice, we're absolutely ramping up those efforts to ensure that patients and staff, because it's equally important to keep staff as well as patients safe during the strike. There's really significant work going into that at the moment. It will mean that we will need to defer and reschedule services, and so there will be significant disruption to services. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to reassure communities that there will be ongoing access to emergency and essential services for anybody who is directly impacted by this in terms of having any kind of surgery, for example, rescheduled. For any affected patient, DHBs will be making contact with patients who might be affected. I'd like to get a message out to our communities that if anybody's got an urgent medical need, please do not hesitate to front up to hospital, to reassure people that might have medical needs, and to remember that they can access GP services and that they can also talk to their local pharmacists who are incredibly helpful. Dial 111 if it is an emergency, and we've also got the health line and the free 0800 number available for people to access. So we're working very, very hard to ensure that if industrial action does go ahead, that there will still be safe access to emergency and essential services.
Helen Mason, who's the DHB spokesperson, joining us live. Thank you very much indeed for your time. It's 5:24. The US President Donald Trump has been on Capitol Hill holding talks with Republican leaders as momentum grows and grows in Congress to end his policy of separating migrant children from their parents at the Mexican border. Images of children behind wire fences have sparked angry criticism. Sleeping on the ground, angry criticism, both at home and abroad. And Mr. Trump is now facing pushback from some senior Republicans who want an end to this separation policy. But the president continues to insist a law change is what's needed, while the Democrats say he could fix it all with a phone call. Here's the BBC's David Willis.
Amid growing concern from members of his own party, the president came to Capitol Hill to talk about the crisis on the southern border.
The system has been broken for many years, the immigration system. It's been a really bad system, probably the worst anywhere in the world. We're going to try and see if we can fix it. Thank you very much.
Having met with Republicans, he was heckled by Democrats.
Quit separating the kids. They're separating the children. Mr. President, don't you have kids?
Still, though, no word of an imminent solution.
We had a great meeting. These are laws that have been broken for many years, decades, and we had a great meeting. Thank you very much.
Pressure to reform America's immigration system is being driven by images such as these. Children kept in cages after being separated from their parents. Under a new zero-tolerance policy, anyone caught crossing the border illegally is now being arrested. 2,000 sons and daughters have been separated from their parents in little over a month. But far from bowing to public pressure, the president is doubling down. In one tweet on the subject, he warned of illegal immigrants infesting the country, and he continues to blame the Democrats, even though Republicans control both chambers of Congress.
The president alone can fix it with this flick of a pen by signing a presidential order to end the agonizing screams of small children who have been separated from their parents. Mr. President, I'll lend you my pen. Any pen. You can fix it yourself.
Mr. Trump insists the solution lies with Congress.
Let the children go!
But as protests sprout up around the country and in the face of growing international condemnation, one Conservative talk show host has likened the situation to a crisis which threatened to derail a previous Republican administration, warning that this could be Trump's Katrina.
David Willis reporting there. Remember, the separations can be absolute. Children and parents are going into detention in different states. No visits, no contact, nothing. Antar Davidson worked at an immigrant children's shelter in Tucson, Arizona. The conditions there are better than in many such places, actual beds and bedrooms, even classrooms for basic learning. But under zero tolerance, the children have no idea when they'll see their parents again. None. Some fear it will be never and don't understand what's going on. And so while the physical conditions are okay, their psychological state?
Well, the psychological state of the children, particularly the ones that were separated from their parents, is basically just can easily be summed up in the word confusion, right? If you're a child, there was about 70 children. Of the 370 of them were what's referred to as tender age. And they were, that means under 12. So a kid, a child that age who is like on a journey with their parents at the point that they're separated from their parents, and they have no idea what's going to happen. And then all of a sudden they're in a facility and people are telling them what to do. And it's traumatizing, I think. And I was able to really observe that in the facility. There were kids that were just displaying very clear signs of trauma.
Antar, can I ask you about your personal experience with some of the children you were dealing with? And as a Portuguese speaker, you were dealing with Brazilian kids. So you resigned in protest effectively. What was it that drove you out in the end? What did you witness?
Okay, well, there was basically the first Brazilians that came. Prior to that, I had noticed with the zero tolerance policy law an influx of very small children who were very traumatized. So I'm talking kids that would be throwing chairs in classrooms, running. It became a common occurrence to see a staff member chasing after a 6-year-old, or, they started to use more what are called CPI holds, which are conflict prevention. It's from the Conflict Prevention Institute. So that's where they will physically grab the child and they were constantly starting to do more refresher courses. So they're, with these kids, the kids acting out in trauma started to become very much less manageable, very young kids. So that was already the air of the place. And when the first Brazilians arrived, it was 3 Brazilians. It was the first at that facility. It was a 16-year-old brother, a 10-year-old sister, and an 8-year-old brother. However, the staff decided that they would be, according to the rules, unfortunately, according to the rules, they were going to have to be separated into 3 different rooms. No one else spoke Portuguese. So in Spanish and English, they were trying to explain to the kids that they would, each of them now, after being separated from their mother, now have to sleep in different rooms. So they called me over the radio and they said, Ansar, we need you to translate this. We need you to tell them that they, so they basically tell them they were, I get to the scene and the kids are there. They actually told me on the radio, they said, tell them they can't hug. The kids they said, tell them they can't hug. I didn't understand what was happening. At that time, I returned to the scene. Fortunately for me, this should be all on camera. So if they choose to test the veracity of this, I welcome them to share the archives. So as I arrived to the scene, they told me, tell them you need to translate that they can't hug. So I make my way over there. I said, I don't know that I'm going to do that, but I'll come and help translate. So I get there, and I see the 3 of them. They're aware now that they're about to be separated from the siblings, each other. And the 2 younger siblings are just holding on with all their might to the older brother, and they're just crying, like crying as in you were just separated from your mother and you're about to be separated from your brother and your sister, crying. And they're holding each other in a circle. And I come to him, and the older brother, and I say in Portuguese, bro, you need to be strong now. Like, I know this is difficult, but, this is a situation where you need to be strong. And he looks at me with tears streaming down his face. He says, how? How can I be strong in a situation like this? Like, look at my siblings. And then at that point, a shift leader arrives to me, and she tells me very aggressively, tell them they can't hug. You need to tell them that they're not allowed to hug in this facility. And I, at that point, flatly said, no, I will not. According to as a human being, that doesn't feel right to me, and I refuse to do that. She then told me that she would inform the shift supervisor and proceeded immediately to try to explain to them in Spanish that they weren't allowed to hug in the facility, as they were still weeping and clutching each other, I would say. Not even hugging, clutching. Really like, please don't take me away from my brother now. And so it was at that point, I tried to make change internally. It was at that point that I realized, being in this job, I would be ordered to do things which I think thankfully, as I've been shown by countless people and now people even in New Zealand, that not just my code of morality, but the world's code of morality, that I would be told to do things that would go counter to that.
Davidson, who was, as you heard, working in a centre for children in Tucson, but resigned in protest effectively over what he was being asked to do. Meanwhile, the United States has withdrawn from what it describes as a hypocritical and self-serving United Nations Human Rights Council over what it calls chronic bias against Israel and a lack of reform. Activists are warning that the move will make advancing human rights globally even more difficult. Here's Nathan Frandino.
The United States withdrew from the United Nations Human Rights Council on Tuesday, the latest U.S. rejection of a multilateral engagement. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, slammed the body in her announcement.
We take this step because our commitment does not allow us to remain a part of a hypocritical and self-serving organization that makes a mockery of human rights.
Haley accused the body of a chronic bias against Israel and of protecting human rights abusers rather than holding them accountable. She criticized member states Russia, China, Cuba, and Egypt for derailing U.S. efforts to reform the Council and said not even countries who shared U.S. values were willing to help.
Ultimately, however, many of these like-minded countries were unwilling to seriously challenge the status quo.
Among the reforms the U.S. was pushing was to make it easier to kick out member states with poor rights records. On Twitter, UN Human Rights Chief Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein called the announcement disappointing, if not surprising, news. The Geneva-based council meets 3 times a year to examine human rights violations worldwide. It voted last month to probe killings in Gaza and accuse Israel of using excessive force. Only the U.S. and Australia voted no.
Thank you.
The move follows decisions by the U.S. to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement and the 2015 Iran nuclear deal.
You're with Checkpoint on RNZ. Thank you for being with us. Coming up before 6, Auckland Police call for witnesses after a violent dairy attack in Greyland leaves a woman in her 60s and her adult son with stab wounds. And Auckland Transport signs off its $16.5 billion 10-year budget, and it's promising a big emphasis on road safety. We'd love your feedback on any of the things we are covering tonight. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook Checkpoint with John Campbell, or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. I think we're historically late tonight, Katrina, with the time almost at 24 minutes to 6 for the 5:30 headlines.
Oh, there you go.
But in your case, better late than never, KB.
Of course, thank you so much, John. District health boards have started putting contingency plans in place for a planned nurses' strike next month, but are optimistic a settlement can be reached first. Nurses have filed a 24-hour strike notice for July the 5th over their long-running pay dispute. A DHB spokesperson, Helen Mason, says they're willing to address other workplace issues, which they hope may avoid strike action when they go into mediation with the nurses on Friday. The American President Donald Trump has held closed-door meetings with Republicans on Capitol Hill amid growing outrage over the separation of families on the US-Mexican border. He reportedly expressed concern about the effects of his zero-tolerance policy and urged the Republicans to pass legislation that keeps families together. But Democrats say legislation is not needed to end the policy, and all Mr. Trump has to do is make a phone call. The State Services Minister, Chris Hipkins, says the use of third-party security firms by government departments has to stop. All government agencies will be scrutinised as part of an expanded probe by the State Services Commission into the use of the private investigators Thompson and Clark. Auckland Transport has signed off on its 10-year budget with a key focus on improving safety for pedestrians, cyclists and motorcyclists and reducing speeds. The $16.5 billion plan includes funding for roading upgrades, public transport projects and safety improvements. A trail of blood led the police to a knife which they believe was used in what they described as an unprovoked and violent attack on a woman and her son in an Auckland dairy last night. The woman in her 60s and her adult son were stabbed at the Highlight Dairy in Greyland and have had surgery. Detective Inspector Scott Baird says a man is helping police with their inquiries. Those are the headlines. I'm back in shortly.
Not terribly long at all. Thanks, Katrina. We'll have more on that incident at the Greyland Dairy last night, that stabbing. But before that, that's coming next. But before that, let's turn to businesses now with Matt Chatterton, who is beaming in from Wellington. Matt, consumer confidence has fallen according to the latest survey. There seems to be an infinite number of surveys, most of them miserably gloomy. What's going on there?
Yeah, I've never come across so many surveys working in business, I tell you. The Westpac McDermott Miller Confidence Index.
Oh yes, that one.
For the second quarter of 2018 fell 2.6 points to 108.6. That's down slightly from the March quarter at 112.2, which was close to the survey's long-run average. We spoke to Chief Economist at Westpac, Dominic Stevens, today. He says the drop is small and is just general unease from consumers rather than anything specific bothering them, or any event that is. He says the main drivers for this unease are because the economy is off the boil a bit, the housing market is cooling, and petrol prices, as we all know, are up, which all play into the minds of consumers. He says this fall in confidence was expected and a further drop should occur if the housing market continues to weaken as is predicted. He did note though that this is nothing to worry about and it could just mean that people are saving a bit more over the winter, which isn't out of the ordinary.
Right, balance of payments figures in for the year to March, right? How are the numbers looking, Matt? I haven't seen them.
Yes, well, I've just been sort of dissecting them all afternoon. These are new numbers for me, coming from sport. They're a bit different, but this is a measure of how much we earned and how much we spent internationally. For the year to March, we had an overall deficit of $7.9 billion, which translates to 2.8% of the value of the economy, or also known as the gross domestic product. That's quite low compared to the historical average of about 3.5 to 4%. If I took you back to the peak of 2008, when the current account deficit was at 7.8% of GDP, at those sorts of levels, credit rating agencies get very nervous about our ability to pay our way in the world. When it's 2.8 like it is now, they don't, which is good. Looking at the details, the tourism sector has continued to boom over the first part of the year, but the agriculture sector didn't do so well. That's because of global dairy prices being down, and meat volumes fell as well. Other interesting things out of the figures, how much we owe the rest of the world, also known as net liability. That stood at 55% of GDP. That's actually the lowest it's been since the series started in 2000. And quickly speaking of GDP numbers, for March quarter are due out tomorrow. Economists are expecting growth to slow in this period. We'll have all those figures on the growth of the economy for you tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Matt. What happened on the markets, just briefly?
The top 50 index closed up 42 points, or 0.5% to 8905. The New Zealand dollar is up ever so slightly on the US to 69.0 cents, and down slightly to 93.3 Australian cents.
Matt Chatterton, thank you very much indeed, Matt. Let's head not very far away from us here as the crow flies. An Auckland woman in her 60s and her adult son are recovering in hospital after being stabbed multiple times at their dairy in what's being described as a violent and utterly unprovoked attack. The police say they've spoken to a number of people today, and one male is helping with their inquiries. The attackers shocked neighbouring shop workers in the central Auckland suburb of Greyland, who fear they could be next. Nita Blake-Person reports.
A trail of blood lined the footpath outside a Greyland dairy today as a team of forensic investigators combed the scene of the stabbing. Detective Inspector Scott Beard says the woman's son was minding the shop, Highlight Dairy, when a male went into the store.
And waited for customers in the shop to leave, and then in a violent, unprovoked attack, stabbed the shop assistant who was behind the counter. They stabbed a number of times. When other members of the family came to assist, a 62-year-old woman was also stabbed.
The offender ran off, but a trail of blood later led the police to what they believe is the weapon.
We followed a blood trail where we actually located the knife.
The mother and her son were rushed to hospital for surgery. The 36-year-old man had critical injuries after being stabbed multiple times, while his mother, who's 62, was seriously injured. Both are now in a stable condition. Their neighbours are in shock.
It's a posh area, so I never thought that this is going to happen here.
Tajinder Singh works at the Pizza Hut across the road from the crime scene. He says he's scared of what the attack means for the area.
This is first incident, so I'm getting worried. So if it will happen again, then it will be hard for us.
Another local, Linda Wing, has lived in the area for nearly 10 years, and she's becoming more worried about violence.
It's been getting a bit heavy around here. There's a lot of people, seems to be more people on the street. I've been here for 9 years, and it seems to be getting heavier. People are more desperate, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's drug related.
The police are yet to formally interview the victims, who Miss Wing describes as lovely people. She says it's upsetting that the family may have been targeted.
It's just tragic, you know, these people are nice people just trying to make a buck, make a living, and it's unfair. And all the other shops next door and surrounding are closed today because of what has happened.
The police say they believe the attack was an aggravated robbery, but they cannot confirm whether anything was taken. They believe there were a number of people in the area last night who may have witnessed the attacker fleeing the scene and are urging them to contact police immediately. Mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Nita Blake-Person, aho.
An Auckland property group says changes to the government's proposed foreign buyer ban may see investors who've been scared off return to the country. The government has eased its foreign buyer ban yesterday, announcing it would allow developers to sell apartments to people offshore as long as they don't live in the property themselves. Tom Furley reports.
The government wants to stop foreign buyers from snapping up homes in a bid to help New Zealanders get a foot on the property ladder. But it's worried that banning overseas buyers altogether would see investment dry up at a time when cities like Auckland are short of at least 30,000 homes. So it's now tweaked the proposed legislation. Foreign buyers will be able to purchase apartments off the plans, but they can only hold on to them if they don't live in the completed property themselves. But National's housing spokesperson Judith Collins isn't impressed, saying investors have already been scared off.
All pretty much the apartment blocks in Auckland that were planned to be built have stopped. And Phil Twyford has admitted that to me too.
However, Housing Minister Phil Twyford says he never admitted to that because it's wrong.
It shouldn't surprise you that the opposition housing spokesperson is misquoting me. I never said anything of the sort. What I've said in many places actually is that there are apartment developments languishing because of a lack of liquidity in the market, and that's primarily because the Australian banks have tightened up due to conditions in the Australian housing market. That's flown through to their New Zealand subsidiaries.
Greenstone Group are project managers who work with a lot of developers, including those involved in Auckland apartments. Its managing director Phil Eaton says the government's initial proposal did cause a lot of overseas investors to look elsewhere.
Several developers who focus on predominantly CBD investments or investment grade product, which is effectively building the rental stock for Auckland, they have openly said that the previous proposals would have killed their businesses. They had put a stop to projects, or they'd slowed them down until they saw clarity. But more than that, we've also seen overseas buyers that were looking to come into the market put a hold on things until it became clear what was happening.
Mr Eaton welcomes the tweaking of the foreign buyers ban, saying the changes could attract back offshore investors. However, Gary Gordon, the head of the developer Legacy Property, says he's not aware of any apartments put off because of the impending law change. He says banks have already tightened lending for projects hoping to use offshore money.
As the banks are, as the pre-sales required to fund these developments, you require local purchases. There's very few developers that are actually selling to offshore buyers at this stage of the market.
Australian and Singapore citizens will be exempt from the ban. The Foreign Buyers Bill is yet to have its second reading in Parliament. For Checkpoint, Tom Furley.
In a first of its kind anywhere in the world, Australia is setting up a national inquiry into sexual harassment in the workplace. It comes as the Me Too movement shines a light on the prevalence of women being sexually harassed and assaulted worldwide. With more, here's the ABC's Stephanie Boris.
Me Too were the words that started a global conversation, and now Australia is leading the way in trying to turn that discussion into action.
We have all the functions to make sure we can help Australia lead the globe on finding new solutions for sexual harassment.
Kate Jenkins is the Sex Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. She's launching a national inquiry into sexual harassment in the workplace.
The ultimate aim is we'll have much better guidance on how to prevent and respond to sexual harassment.
The independent inquiry will look at the drivers of sexual harassment in the workplace. Public consultations will be held in major cities and regional centres, and Australians will have the opportunity to lodge submissions.
We'll look at the effectiveness of the laws, but even more importantly, what is going on in workplaces.
The investigation will also look at the financial impacts of women who are sexually harassed in the workplace. Minister for Women Kelly O'Dwyer says until now there hasn't been much focus on the economic problems facing women who are targeted.
It might mean that she loses her job, or it might mean that she's been denied promotions.
The federal government is supportive of the inquiry, Kelly O'Dwyer describing it as a world first. And she says other nations will be keeping a close eye on what Australia is doing.
This is not only a significant inquiry for us here in Australia, but there will probably be some learnings that other countries can take.
The 12-month inquiry will cost nearly $1 $1 million, and half of that will be covered by the federal government. Kelly O'Dwyer says it's money well spent.
Sexual harassment is a very real issue for many people in Australia.
Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins says the number of people sexually harassed in the workplace is growing, and to show how anyone can be impacted, she's opened up about her history.
I don't talk about my experience a whole lot, but certainly in my work experience, I think like so many women, I've experienced sexual harassment.
She says the Me Too movement has helped women find their voice and reveal the prevalence of the problem.
That is a big driver behind why I think everyone is interested to change that experience.
And she's hopeful that can be achieved through the independent inquiry.
Success for me will be at the end that we come up with a new blueprint that will most certainly include many of the initiatives that are already in place, but better guidance for employers on how they can help improve the workplace.
It's Kate Jenkins, who is the Sex Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission, ending that report from the ABC. Back in New Zealand, with the time coming up to 10 to 6, hundreds of people gathered in Rotorua today to farewell Tale Morrison, who died from cervical cancer last week. Ms Morrison's cervical cancer social media campaign, Smear Your Mere, went viral earlier this year as she encouraged women to have regular smear tests for cervical cancer. One bad experience during a smear test led her to not going back for a decade, and that meant her cancer was diagnosed too late. She was surrounded by whānau, friends and loved ones at her tangi as they remembered how much the 42-year-old had achieved in her life. And Te Manu Kōrehi reporter John Boynton was there.
With Lake Rotorua as a backdrop and steam billowing into the crisp morning air, hundreds of mourners gathered at Te Papa i Oru Marae to say goodbye to Tale Morrison. It was a reflection of the admiration, respect and love so many had for the fierce kapahaka star and high school teacher. Her mum, Sandy Morrison, says Tale was someone who always brought people together.
She cared for all her cousins and she was a great tuakana. And she cared for my brothers and sisters, promising that she would look after all of us in our old age.
And she was the glue which held her whānau together.
She would tell me monthly what I had to do, where I needed to be, what I was doing, what the expectations were, whose birthday it was, and she made it really easy. Our family are going to have to learn new traditions and manage our lives without her.
She describes her daughter's fight against cervical cancer, which became a national campaign, as selfless and valiant. Next month, a fundraising concert to Tale with Love, which is already sold out, will take place to fundraise for the Smear Your Mere campaign to encourage women to get tested regularly.
And in the midst of the most difficult experience of her life, she decided to start a national campaign, apply for jobs and do a TEDx talk.
Former Māori Party leader Te Ururua Flavel's children grew up alongside Tale in Rotorua. One of his favourite memories he shares of Tale was when they both were going to sit a Māori weaponry exam. It was a 1-hour test which pushed both physically and mentally, but it was Tale's spirit of determination to finish the test that stood out.
That's the wonderful memory, is just that inspiration that she brought not only to me, but to all of her children, to her whole family, that sheer inspiration, determination, that once she was in the zone on a particular thing that she would finish it.
This determination carried through to her campaign, Mr Flavel says, and raised important questions around healthcare for Māori women.
Maybe the health system's got to be a little bit better in addressing Māori women in their world and promote far more awareness about cervical cancer and cancer across the board.
Tale's only daughter Hannah will give birth in a few weeks and says her mum was looking forward to the birth of her first mokopuna. In a tribute to her mum, she read out the poem Phenomenal Woman by the Black American poet Maya Angelou.
When you see me passing, it ought to make you proud. I say, it's in the click of my heels, the bend of my hair, the palm of my hand, the need for my care. 'Cause I'm a woman, phenomenal woman, that's me. That's what my mum taught me.
E te māreikura kia au te moe. I rotorua mo te hōtaka o te ahi pōnei, ko John Boynton aho.
6 minutes to 6. New Zealand drivers are at risk of losing free windscreen replacement in their insurance cover. The country's second largest general insurer, Vero, has announced it will now charge an excess on windscreen replacement claims because of rising costs. There are fears more companies will follow suit, leading to fewer people fixing or replacing their windscreens. Mediana Johnson reports.
Vero says more and more people are claiming for glass replacement, and it's no longer sustainable. Joe Mason from New Zealand Brokers says it doesn't help that the cost is going up, as newer models have windscreens with UV protection and light sensors. She says the changes will be a culture shock to most Kiwis.
It's not something that New Zealanders are used to. They've had free windscreen glass for such a long time. I really think this goes to the real psyche of a Kiwi. You know, you've never had to, I mean, you pay for your windscreen glass obviously through your premiums, but they've never actually had to pay an excess, so it's quite a change in the insurance landscape.
Joe Mason says the change will most likely sting people with older cars, as the average age of a New Zealand vehicle is 14 years. Vero says the number of customers likely to be affected is small, and windscreen repairs will still be covered. But the Director of Auto and House Glass, Barry Sullivan, fears people will not fix their windscreens if they have to pay.
Some clients don't have that access, so how long are they going to run around with broken windscreens before they get it repaired? I mean, in some cases, warrants of fitness are 12 monthly, so they could get a crack day after the vehicle's been given a warrant of fitness. Theoretically, it can be quite a bad crack. They can run around in that vehicle for 11 and a half months before they go in to get another warrant.
In Wellington, there is mixed reactions about the insurance changes.
Absolutely. Very concerned. I had it done in the past before, and it was so easy, simple.
No change for me because we don't have a car.
Every consumer wants to save as much money as they can and, be covered as much as they can as well. So obviously, that would be a concern.
We have 3 cars, so it's not very often that we replace a windscreen though, so it's not a big problem for us.
The Motor Transport Agency Chief Executive Craig Pomare says people should look for alternative insurance providers if they're affected by the policy change.
It's important that people, if they do have an issue with their windscreen, they get that obviously seen to. And if their insurance company is not prepared to assist in that regard, then they should shop around and find someone who is prepared to do that.
Craig Pomare says he expects more insurance companies will follow Vero's lead. Ko Mediana Johnson tēnei.
It's coming up to 3 minutes to 6, just before the news at 6. Are kids at an Auckland school being shortchanged when it comes to their uniform? Dozens of parents are pushing for long pants to be part of the uniform at all Wairoa Primary, but to date they've been turned down on the grounds that they're too expensive. They say children are shivering in shorts or culottes in winter. They told our reporter Jessie Chang they don't understand why.
The shorts are just normal. Yeah, so they are quite thick. But the socks just he just ends up with just this floppy. They all like bunch down, and then he takes his shoes off, and most of his socks just hanging off the end of his foot. So he's just got these little legs hanging out of his shorts.
Jamie Travis is showing me her son's school uniform. She says 7-year-old Levi has skinny legs and is always talking about how cold it is wearing shorts in winter. Miss Travis found it strange that the school didn't have long pants as a uniform option, but when she raised the issue with the Board of Trustees, she was told it would be too expensive, and other schools in the area all stuck with shorts.
Levi was so disappointed. I felt like I failed him a little bit, and I thought, no, I'm not going to just let it slide. Because there's absolutely no valid reason why. They're just kids, they're cold.
Jamie Travis was told long pants would cost just under $50 a pop, less than the school jumper. Not satisfied with the board's response, she set out to appeal the decision. Ms Travis went online and asked parents of other kids at Wairoa Primary what they thought. She says there was a flood of support for long pants, with ex-students also getting in touch.
Lots of people were commenting saying, what? We used to wear track pants when I went there. I don't know why they got rid of them. I never actually got told by anybody that there were, nothing about how they used to be and why there wasn't anymore. I thought there never had been.
The Board of Trustees and the principal of Wairoa Primary School declined to comment on the issue, but Natalie Melville, whose son Ryan goes to the school, says he wants to wear trousers too.
He's been asking me, when can I wear pants, Mummy, when can I wear pants? So I'm sitting here saying, well, you can't. It's the rules are that you have to wear shorts. And he's like, but I'm really cold. And there's not much I can do about it.
Jamie Travis sent letters of support for long pants to the board last night and was told earlier this afternoon it would now conduct a survey. Those results will be discussed in a month's time at the next board meeting. Ms Travis says that's ridiculous because the board has already received statements from dozens of parents who want the option of long pants. And by the time the issue gets settled, summer is likely to be here. Mo te hōtaka o te ahi nei, ko Jesse Chang tēnei.
20 seconds before 6, just before the 6 o'clock news, Paula Henderson from Whangarei is saying it's all very well to not have free windscreen insurance, but good road workers in the north leave less crap on the road to damage their windscreens with. We have taken your concerns and passed them on, Paula.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, good evening. Ko Katrina Batten tēnei. District health boards are optimistic a nurses' strike will be avoided. Today, the Nurses' Union confirmed an intention to strike next month on July the 5th and possibly again on the 12th. The DHB spokesperson, Helen Mason, says they're still in mediation with the union and she's optimistic a settlement will be reached. The Nurses' Union this week rejected an offer worth more than $500 million. Ms Mason told Checkpoint it's not just pay nurses are fighting for, but better working conditions.
And we've heard nurses' frustrations and their concerns around this, and DHB's responded to it. So the reason that I'm optimistic is I think that there are things outside of pay and outside of the dollars that are on the table at the moment, which is $500 million, and that we can work on.
Helen Mason says the strike would cause significant disruption to services, and the district health boards have started putting contingency plans in place. Auckland Transport is promising a bigger focus on safety as part of its 10-year budget. The agency's board signed off the plan in a meeting this afternoon. It includes $16.5 billion for roading upgrades, public transport projects and safety improvements. Auckland Transport's chair, Lester Levy, says one of the big priorities is improving safety for all road users, but especially pedestrians, cyclists and motorcyclists. He says reducing speeds is key to that.
We would like to see lower speeds in town centres. We'd like to see lower speeds outside schools and other places where children are. We'd like to see lower speeds on some of the unsafe roads in terms of rural roads.
Lester Levy says such initiatives will have been worked out with other agencies like the Ministry of Transport. The US President has been on Capitol Hill holding talks with Republican leaders as momentum grows to end his policy of separating migrant children with their parents at the Mexican border. Donald Trump continues to insist a law change is needed. It has called on Congress to come up with a solution quickly. The BBC's Gary O'Donoghue reports.
Despite having used executive powers to introduce zero tolerance at the border, President Trump says it's now down to Congress to fix the consequences of that decision. The difficulty is, even with majorities in both chambers, Republicans are finding it close to impossible to settle on a plan they can all rally around. One group favours a comprehensive set of reforms that would introduce funding for a border wall, one of the president's key promises. Another group is pressing for a compromise approach that would make it easier to attract Democrat support.
Gary O'Donoghue reporting. A senior ride operator at Dreamworld on Queensland's Gold Coast has told an inquest it was impossible to manage all of the responsibilities required of him while loading a new raft every minute. The inquest is being held into the deaths of 4 people, including New Zealander Cindy Lowe, who were killed on the Thunder River Rapids ride in October 2016. Peter Nemeth was one of 2 people running the ride. The court heard he was responsible for dozens of checks before a 6-person raft was loaded every minute, including supervising colleagues, monitoring raft movements and water pumps, as well as telling people to smile for the camera. An animal welfare activist is alarmed authorities may have been communicating with a controversial private investigator that's targeted him in the past. Inquiries from RNZ News have resulted in the uncovering of what the Ministry for Primary Industries describes as potentially serious misconduct by former staff members relating to their communications with the company Thompson & Clark. Farm Watch's John Darrick says he's been warned off targeting pig farmers in the past by an investigator hired by Thompson & Clark. He says the ministry is supposed to be looking after animal welfare, not potentially helping to undermine groups like his. A trail of blood led the police to a knife which they believe was used in a violent attack on a woman and her son in an Auckland dairy last night. The woman in her 60s and her adult son have had surgery after they were stabbed in their Greyland dairy. Detective Inspector Scott Baird says the woman's son was minding the Highlight dairy when a man entered the store.
Waited for customers in the shop to leave, and then in a violent, unprovoked attack, stabbed the shop assistant who was behind the counter. They stabbed a number of times. When other members of the family came to assist, a 62-year-old woman was also stabbed.
Scott Baird says a man is helping police with their inquiries. One of the best-known names in American manufacturing is being dropped from the Dow Jones Industrial Average next week. Boston-based General Electric will be removed from the index before trading opens on June the 26th, ending the company's run of more than 100 years in the 30-company blue-chip index. General Electric has been struggling in recent years, shrinking dramatically since it became entangled in the financial crisis a decade ago. It's 6:05. Sport. The football Ferns coach Andreas Heref has been placed on leave while an independent investigation is carried out into a relationship breakdown between him and players in the national women's team. On Monday, New Zealand Football received a letter from the Professional Footballers Association outlining several complaints from players about Heref. While he's been placed on leave, he could end up being suspended as the process unfolds. New Zealand Football Chief Executive Andy Martin says it's disappointing the situation has got to this stage.
Very disappointed to get so many comments through. You know, reading them all, it's really sad to see those sort of comments coming from anybody but any of our employees. So we've got to take it very seriously. We've got to make sure we put a proper process in place to protect everybody, the coach as well, and we make sure that we understand just what's been going on.
Andy Martin. The New Zealand doubles player Marcus Daniel will play multiple Grand Slam champions Novak Djokovic and Stan Wawrinka at the Queen's Club tournament in London tonight. Daniel and his Dutch player Wesley Koolhof, who lost in qualifying at the weekend, have been handed a lucky loser's spot in the main draw. The New Zealand women's cricket team begin a tri-series in England tonight, playing a T20 match against the hosts in Taunton. South Africa are also involved. And the Australian golfing great Peter Thomson has died after a battle with Parkinson's disease. The 5-time British Open champion was 88. That's the news.
Another tweak in housing policy.
Discriminating against people who bought houses in New Zealand with good intentions, and also when not allowing them to buy in the future. It's a very small part of the market.
Or is it a back down?
Clamping down on capital coming into the market. And I actually think the whole thing has been a complete con.
The Minister says New Zealand first.
With this rapid concentration of wealth around the world, I think we have to be a bit careful that we keep the New Zealand housing market for New Zealanders.
Come over to our place. Morning Report with Guy Aspinall and Susie Ferguson, weekdays from 6.
Then on 9 to noon, Los Angeles' first Chief Sustainability Officer Matt Peterson on making solar mandatory and improving our building code. And after 10, Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Frances Fitzgerald, whose new book traces the history of the evangelical Christian movement and how it became a political force in America. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland and Auckland, north of Orewa, Rain with heavy falls and localised downpours and possible thunderstorms gradually clearing tomorrow afternoon and evening, strong southeasterlies in exposed places. For the remainder of Auckland, Waikato and Coromandel Peninsula, cloudy with scattered rain north of Cambridge, clearing tomorrow and becoming mainly fine. Waitomo to the Kapiti coast, including Bay of Plenty and the central high country, mainly fine but cloudy skies today from Taupō northwards. Gisborne to Wairarapa, often cloudy with a few showers, clearing inland Wairarapa later tomorrow. Wellington and Marlborough fine, apart from cloud and a few showers about the eastern coasts and ranges. Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland, still the place to be, fine. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, cloudy periods today, becoming mostly fine tomorrow. However, low cloud and fog persisting in some valleys, frosts morning and night, and the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods, a few showers clearing tomorrow. It's coming up to 6:09 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten. We began the program an hour ago, of course, looking at MPI and its relationship with Thomson and Clark, and also the SIS and its relationship with Thomson and Clark, neither of them fronting, and we expressed some consternation and disappointment at the fact that government agencies that feel able to use Thomson and Clark to scrutinise the behaviour of others in secret, government agencies with the power of MPI and the SIS, are not able to subject themselves to scrutiny in terms of a media interview. Well, we've received a media statement from the State Services Commissioner, Peter Hughes, which we appreciate. It's been emailed in. The public interest here is clear and strong, and good on the media for pursuing that. That's why I have ordered an investigation across the whole of state services. We are now in the inquiry process using my powers under the State Sector Act. These are significant. This is a serious process with potentially serious consequences for the individuals involved. I'm determined to get answers to the questions that have been raised, but I am not going to compromise the inquiry process in any way by talking now about matters that have yet to be investigated. At the end of this, as I always do, I will front up to the media and release all the information relevant to the inquiry along with the investigators and relevant chief executives. We will answer all questions put to me and them. In the meantime, we need to let the inquiry get to the bottom of this. That's from State Services Commissioner Peter Hughes. Came in about 6:02 and we appreciate it. Auckland Transport has signed off its $16.5 billion 10-year budget, and it's promising a big emphasis on road safety. The Regional Land Transport Program divvies up funding for projects around the city, from cycleways and busways to red light cameras and intersection upgrades. Our reporter Sarah Robson has the details.
Auckland is home to almost 1.7 million people, and the population is expected to grow by another 300,000 over the next 10 years. Auckland Transport's 10-year budget lays out how it will prioritise its funding for future transport projects. It includes $10 billion of capital funding and $6.5 billion of operational funding. Auckland Transport's chair, Lester Levy, is promising a greater focus on road safety to reduce deaths and serious injuries.
Emphasis on vulnerable road users, therefore we're talking about pedestrians, we're talking about cyclists, we're talking about motorcyclists, we're talking about children, we're talking about elderly people.
The plan includes funding for red light cameras and more money to fix high-risk urban and rural roads. But Lester Levy says getting speeds down is the big priority.
We would like to see lower speeds in town centres. We'd like to see lower speeds outside schools and other places where children are. We'd like to see lower speeds on some of the unsafe roads in terms of rural roads.
But Lester Levy says any changes like that will have to be done in conjunction with other agencies, like the Ministry of Transport. Matt Lowry, who runs the Greater Auckland blog, says making the city safer is money well spent.
We absolutely need to improve safety, and there's a report recently that Auckland Transport had, an independent report, which said a lot of the blame for that sits with Auckland Transport and the police for effectively completely ignoring safety issues. And so we absolutely need to have a big focus on reducing the number of people who are dying on our roads.
The 10-year budget includes more funding for public transport, including buses, as well as a boost for walking and cycling. Matt Lowry says it delivers what Auckland desperately needs.
We're seeing a lot of investment in public transport overall, whether it be light rail, projects like the City Rail Link, which are underway, improved buses. All these things will help encourage more people to get out of their cars, or at least give people an option that they can travel free of congestion at most of the time.
Kim Campbell from the Employers and Manufacturers Association says now that the budget is done and dusted, Auckland Transport should get on and do the work.
for the first time in a decade, the funding is basically now in place. So there are no excuses to get on with it.
But Kim Campbell says there are some gaps.
The biggest worry that we have, particularly for business, is that even after all the $28 billion or whatever is invested over the next, say, 10 years or so, we're still really no better off in terms of congestion than we are now. So it's only barely going to keep up.
Auckland Transport's 10-year budget still has to get final sign-off from the Auckland Council. It all links up with the bigger transport plan agreed to by the government and Auckland Council. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Sarah Robson, aho.
It's 6:13 earlier in Checkpoint. We were speaking to a man who worked at one of the detention centres, which is holding the children separated from their parents who are illegally crossing the Mexican border into the United States. A lot of you responded very strongly to that interview. It was distressing. And he described in fairly blunt terms the experience of dealing with those children. He resigned as a result of what he was being asked to do. This is getting a lot of coverage globally, and many in Donald Trump's Republican Party are starting to scramble and distance themselves from the administration's zero-tolerance immigration policy. The policy has seen more than 2,300 children separated from their parents since the beginning of last month. As images of children behind wire fences spark anger and criticism both home and abroad, Mr Trump is facing pushback from some top Republicans who do now want an end to the policy. Others still support it, especially though those opposing it especially are people who are staring at defeat in congressional midterms. This is a polarising issue and swing voters, it seems, don't like it. Here's the BBC's Nick Bryant with more.
Let the children go now!
Outrage at children being taken from their parents is now being voiced in the streets. This a protest outside the Border Protection Agency enforcing the zero-tolerance approach to illegal immigrants authorised by Donald Trump. Demonstrators adamant that families should remain together.
I find it horrifying. It's unacceptable, it's evil, it's disgusting, and it's an embarrassment to the United States.
This is a moral catastrophe, and we're breaking up families, and it has to end now.
For Donald Trump, the integrity of America's borders is just as important as the sanctity of its flag. He's portraying himself as the true patriot in this debate, and knows his hardline stance on immigration helped win him the White House.
We want a great country. We want a country with heart. But when people come up, they have to know they can't get in. Otherwise, it's never going to stop.
Images of children detained behind wire mesh in what looked like cages were released by the US government, hoping perhaps they'll have a deterrent effect. But senior Republicans, including Trump loyalists, have criticised what they see as the cruelty of the policy.
I'm very concerned about that. I'm not real happy with the way things are going right now, so I've asked for a pause so we can really evaluate this and do what's in the best interest of these children and their families. And we ought to be doing everything in our power to bring the children together with their parents.
The president has headed to Capitol Hill to press for a new immigration bill and is claiming the Democrats are blocking its passage. But ending child separations requires no change in the law. Donald Trump could do that by picking up the phone.
That's the BBC's Nick Bryant. Meanwhile, the state of New York intends to file a lawsuit against the Trump administration over the family separations. The state's governor says it will argue that the administration is, and I quote, violating the constitutional rights of thousands of immigrant children and their parents who have been separated at the border. New York filing a lawsuit. It's coming up to 17 minutes past 5. Today is World Refugee Day, and in Bangladesh, 6. The concentration of refugees is staggering. It's believed up to 1 million Rohingya refugees are now living in camps in Cox's Bazar. 1 million people across from the Myanmar border after fleeing a violent crackdown by the Myanmar military and decades of persecution in the country. The camps are mushrooming into their own cities. They're not great cities, though, and the Bangladeshi government is now working to relocate tens of thousands of people amid fears of landslides, waterborne diseases, unsavoury conditions, terrible conditions for children. The BBC's Dan Johnson went to Cox's Bazar and filed this special report.
Rohingya refugees are on the move again, still searching for a safe place to live. Life is tough, even before it begins. Hasina's baby's due in a month. She's struggling with back pain and a swollen leg. My house fell down, she says. I was forced to stay with others. A landslide damaged my home, says Aziz Fatima. For 5 days, I didn't even have drinking water. And people keep coming to this, the newest part of the camp. There is stable land here, stronger homes and better drainage. But many more are left facing the monsoon.
People are living in such close living quarters. The potential for water as it's flowing down the street to contaminate not only the water supply but also getting into people's houses. It's incredibly difficult to stay clean in this sort of environment.
The problem is these homes are built up high but right on the edge of very steep cliffs, and the land is starting to crack, and the fear is that when the rain intensifies it will undermine these hillsides. The soil will shift and drop away, and the homes could go with it. This was last year's exodus from Myanmar. The Burmese military said it was cracking down on Rohingya militants. The UN described it as ethnic cleansing. Across the border, they found shelter in Bangladesh, but here there are new challenges. It rained every day last week, a miserable taste of what's to come. This is a vibrant community full of resilient people, but they live on borrowed land. More than 700,000 cling to these hillsides, and the numbers keep on growing.
That was Dan Johnson in Cox's Bazaar. Yesterday, the UN released new figures showing the number of refugees and internally displaced people around the world climbed to 68.5 million. That was last year. That sets a new record for the 5th year in a row, 68.5 million refugees and internally displaced people on the planet. Sarah Robson's story just after the news at 6 about transport plans in Auckland and the money being spent. Cycling, says Jill, is not feasible in Auckland. It's a hilly isthmus with huge distances to travel from suburbs to places of work. What we need are park and ride car parks so we can catch the trains. If I don't get to Papakura station by 6:30 or 7, I have to drive around and around trying to find a park on nearby streets. It's the same as other totally inadequate parking facilities in South Auckland and no link buses so we can leave our cars at home. Says Jill, we receive a lot of similar feedback from people who use the buses in from Albany on the North Shore. Thank you, Jill, for your feedback. Do text us 2101 if your experience of using Park and Ride is blighted by your inability to actually find the park from which you can ride. Lots of people texting in to complain about roading contractors in their part of New Zealand, and we have to say so far in the evidence of the texts we're receiving, the West Coast and Northland, your roading contractors can do much, much better. That's in response to the fact that you won't have free insurance cover, no excess insurance cover on your windscreens. People frothing at the mouth. About the quality of road repair work on the West Coast and in Northland. Let's go back to a story we looked at a bit earlier. This is a polarising story. Some of you say we don't care about sport. This isn't a sports issue, it's an employment issue. The football Ferns coach, Andreas Heraf, is on special leave whilst an independent investigation is carried out into the relationship breakdown between him and some of his players. On Monday, New Zealand Football received a letter from the Professional Footballers Association outlining several complaints from players in the national women's team. Now, CEO Andy Martin, who last week said he wasn't aware of any issues between the players and his coach, told in media conferences this afternoon things had changed.
Right up until probably the week or 2 weeks before the last activity, the Japan game, we were getting endorsements about the change programme, what was going on from players, from a whole range of people, some in the public domain that you'll have seen. So going into that camp, we knew we were making changes. We knew Andreas was making changes that we'd asked him to make. And this was very much about performance and making sure we drive our performance up. Because let's be clear, you know, the last 2 Pinnacle events, as I said last week, we did not perform. So changes were needed. So we knew there was change management going on, and there were some people on board and some people not. But the extent of what's come through from the letters, there was no indication of that at all. And as I said last week, as soon as we get facts, and look, the process has worked. The reason why the union is there is for our employees to be able to have a say. And that's worked and it's come through and we've responded quickly.
The employees certainly did have a say. New Zealand football president Derek Shaw said he was disappointed. 13 players felt the need to lodge a formal complaint. 13, remember there's 11 in a football team, although this is the wider squad we're talking about. But he said they'd also received about 6 letters of support. Mr Shaw was asked if the process of appointing a coach would be revisited.
We'll certainly look at the outcomes from the review process, and if there are systemic issues we need to look at relative to those processes, they would certainly be considered by the board.
So do you concede that the decision to appoint Andreas to this role while he was the technical director may have been the wrong one?
I mean, we've got to let the review run its course, and I think it's important that we don't, prejudge the outcomes from that. I think there's some things that we need to look at by way of process now. So information, there's a freer flow of information on a more regular basis. I think that when you look at some of the things that have happened in other sports, just sort of more recently, around cycling, netball, and so forth, it's quite clear that there's sort of, a need for what I'd call a more systemic sort of check-in on player welfare.
A systemic check-in on player welfare. New Zealand football said a decision as to who would replace the coach whilst he was on special leave was yet to be decided. It will be a systemic decision, obviously. The government says too many migrants aren't making an effort to learn English. Now, that isn't the American government, it's the Australian one. New laws to introduce tougher English exams for migrants failed to pass through Parliament last October, but the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull is reviving the plan. Critics argue the changes are discriminatory. The BBC's Sydney correspondent Phil Mercer has the story.
After 10 years in Australia, Ran Malik, a disability support worker from India, fears that he may never become a citizen. He's on a temporary work visa and says that a new language test would be unfair.
There's a lot of things I'm worried about at the moment, especially the English test, which I think it's actually it's just an act of racism. I've got a lot of friends from back home who actually moved to Canada in the last 3-4 years, and they already become citizens. And I just thought that could be another option for me, either to move to Canada or maybe look pretty close to Australia, maybe New Zealand.
New laws to toughen English exams for migrants failed to pass Parliament last year, but the plan is being revived.
The key to successful integration into the Australian community, to economic success, every success, social success, in becoming part of the community, is being able to speak English.
Official figures show that about 1 in 4 migrants who came to Australia last year have little or no English, and the government thinks that too few are making the effort to become proficient. But campaigners argue that most settlers do want to learn the language, and they believe that the new test will set the bar too high.
This will discriminate against large section of Australian society. This English tests are very difficult to pass. It is at academic level, and even people who completed universities are struggling with this test.
The debate isn't whether new migrants need to learn the language, but how competent they become.
We have to speak English to understand with other people. That's the main language here, so we have to respect that.
It's impossible to get a job if you don't know the language. As easy as that.
Generally, people do want to learn English. They do want to improve. They want to gain that independence and that autonomy in the community.
They live in cultural bubbles. They should be able to speak English. Well, otherwise they just don't fit in.
One that is inhabited. Australia wants its new citizens to embrace not only its language, but also its values, such as respect for democracy and gender equality.
I remember.
But is this pursuit of harmony and cohesion causing division and tension?
Phil Mercer reporting there from Sydney. Let's stay in Australia. Corporate Australia has been jolted today by news one of the country's largest employers is to slash 8,000 jobs. The telecommunications company Telstra has announced a major overhaul and a renewed cost-cutting effort. The costs of staff, it's the biggest single loss of jobs in the country's corporate history. Here's the ABC's Matthew Doran.
More than 32,000 talented employees working in over 20 countries contribute to our success. That's a direct quote from Telstra's last annual report. Now, more than a quarter will go.
We anticipate that about 8,000 roles net will leave the company over the next 3 years.
Telstra Chief Executive Andy Penn broke the news this morning, saying executives, middle management and contractors will bear the brunt.
And that's obviously very difficult news to share. because Telstra is an amazing organisation, amazing family of people, and that was why it was so important for me to speak to the teams first in delivering that news.
Mr Penn argues he doesn't expect the job cuts to favour staff in Australia before those overseas, or vice versa. It's part of a massive restructure for Australia's former monopoly phone provider, aimed at saving a further $1 billion by 2022, on top of already announced savings measures worth $1.5 billion.
If we're going to be competitive, if we're going to deliver the sort of products and services to our customers, if we're going to deliver for our shareholders, I have to be authentic and I have to be transparent that that's the scale of change that Telstra needs today.
Andy Penn argues that despite the massive cuts, Telstra will still be the nation's #1 telco and will be at the forefront of delivering Australia's next generation 5G mobile network.
Customers across the country already had ongoing issues with Telstra outages, 000 services, mobile outages, you name it, it's been happening for Telstra over a long period of time.
Shane Murphy from the CEPU, the union representing telecommunications workers, doesn't buy it.
With the announcement today, those problems can only be further exacerbated. We're absolutely alarmed. First news we heard, we expected an announcement from Andy Penn to the market today, but we certainly didn't expect the announcement to be 8,000 jobs.
This is a difficult day for the staff of Telstra.
Mitch Fifield is the Federal Communications Minister.
Telstra will be putting in place a $50 million transition program to assist affected staff. It's up to each telco business to make judgments as to the best way to meet the needs of their customers.
While Telstra's mobile infrastructure, such as mobile phone towers, will remain part of the company's core retail business, another aspect of this restructure is the hiving away of much of Telstra's assets, including cables, telephone exchanges and data centres, into a new division called Telstra InfraCo. That means Telstra could sell it off in the future, if the right bidder came along once the NBN rollout is complete.
It's Matthew Doran from the ABC. Tomorrow night we are inside a youth detention centre. And let me tell you, what we learn is, well, confronting. That's tomorrow night on Checkpoint. It's the first of a three-part story. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you tomorrow at 5.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. District health boards are optimistic a nurses' strike planned for next month will be avoided. Donald Trump calls on Congress to come up with a legislative solution as outrage grows over family separations on the border. The State Services Minister says the use of third-party security firms by government departments has to stop. Auckland Transport puts safety first, and consumer confidence takes a knock with the slowing housing market and rising fuel costs. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Tonight on Inside Out, John Coltrane, as you've literally never heard him before. A sneak peek at a recently discovered album by Coltrane. Ooh, very exciting. Plus Miles, Bill Evans and new music from Dog. That's Inside